midst of the election. There's the recording. We're right in the midst of the election, and I'm sure everyone has a lot going on. So I think we have an hour booked. I'm gonna be as expeditious as possible in going through this. I think for obvious reasons, there's been a lot of interest in what's happening in voter registration, especially since Dobbs, and open question in terms of how that has perhaps changed the narrative in this election. I'm not going to be able to provide any concrete answers, but I'm happy to have a tool that we shared with y'all publicly over the last couple of weeks. And I'm going to go through today that I think will help y'all draw some of your more informed conclusions as we look at which groups are more or less engaged, and we put it in a historical context. So as Shilpa said, I'm going to screen share. I'm going to go through a quick presentation here with just some context and a little bit about what this tool can and can't do. And then I'm just going to go to the website and actually do some live counts so you can see how it actually works. And then I'm happy to take questions, both on how the dashboard works and, broader questions about what we're actually seeing in the data and the sort of trends that are jumping out at us. So Shilpa, I need to be given permission to share my screen. It looks like it's disabled. And I get the fun job of not being able to see anyone. And y'all get to see me. So that's going to make me be even faster as I go through this whole process.
Tom, you should be able to now.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
All right, here we are. So first, I want to give credit to our great team at TargetSmart. So the reason that we're able to do this is we have an amazing team that goes out, collects all this data, first of all, which is no small feat to get it from across the country and make sure that it's always very current. And then also our team, our strategic consulting team, and especially Alex Falco, and actually building this dashboard, which is a super cool tool. Though I have to admit, it's taken up way too much of my free time. Some people unwind in the evening by watching a TV show or having a drink, and I do it by looking at this dashboard. So we all have our things. So, I think y'all are sort of familiar with the backstory here. There's been this arc and trajectory in terms of data journalism, great advances made, some really cool things that folks in the media are doing with political and election data, but there are challenges that I think we all still face, but it's certainly those in the media. The data sets can be messy, they're segmented, they're incomplete. Context is missing. I think context is incredibly important when we're analyzing this data, to put it in the context of previous election cycles. Something can look interesting by itself, but until you see it and how it compares to the same time periods in previous election cycles, it can be misleading. And so that's something that we've worked to fill a role. The primary work we do is working with Democratic candidates, progressive organizations, and there is this component of it too, which is really providing accurate information to be a part of the public discourse. So a lot of times narratives can congeal that are based on maybe faulty or flawed or just gaps in information. And so what we try to do is make sure that there's accurate information in there to improve the American public's understanding of what's going on in these elections. So what we do, as I said, the great team we have, bringing in a combination of publicly available voter data, and then appending to that commercial consumer data, building models, and then really layering an analysis on top of that, which is what you'll see in this dashboard. So for those of you who haven't clicked on, again, I'll show you in a minute. We'll actually just go through the website. We can share the URL for those of you who don't have it. But what it looks like is this. We've got context going back for 3 cycles for this year, last year, the presidential, in 2018. Obviously every election comes with caveat. Comparing to 2020 It's a presidential cycle. Comparing to 2018, yes, it's the last midterm, but different dynamic. Especially as we get closer to the election, we think of the impact the pandemic had, changes in voting and electoral systems that took place in 2020. It's really why we provide both. So again, we're collecting this data state by state. We're standardizing it so you can compare it across states or within a state. And then because of all the data that we're appending to the voter files, we have the ability to analyze and aggregate and really summarize by a whole bunch of literally several hundred different variables. In this dashboard, you're going to see those that are the sort of obvious ones that we believe are most key to understanding the electorate. So age, gender, race or ethnicity, party registration in states that offer that, modeled partisanship in states that do not. Well, and you can use the modeled partisanship in the party registration states as well. Voter frequency, are we seeing people, and in this case, this is new registrants, but when we talk about the early vote data and actually the dashboard Target Early that I think a lot of you are familiar with, it'll be coming out very soon, the ability to look at that data in the context of how people voted in the past. And so this dashboard here, even though our files are updated on a constant ongoing basis, for this dashboard, we're just updating it twice a week, which gives you, I know some people would love to see it every day, but twice a week gives you a really sweet spot of being able to look at it, see very current data that's, going to be no more than a few days old. When you look at the dashboard, we'll look at it in a minute, you'll see for any state, it'll tell you when that state was most recently updated because states update their voter files on varying cadences. So questions in terms of what we can learn from the dashboard. The obvious thing and the obvious question is the notion that voter registration provides a window into intensity and enthusiasm. I think that's the big question that we're all wrestling with. The notion that Republicans had this intensity and enthusiasm advantage coming into this year. They had this sort of traditional advantage that you would expect the party that's not in the White House, not in control of Congress to have, which has been the historical precedent going back several decades. And then again, as I started off, the open question of what impact Dobbs had and how that's impacted this election. Well, the first indicator of how different groups are responding and are they engaging in higher levels than we saw prior to Dobbs is going to come out in voter registration. And again, you see this all here. You can break that down by all these different groups we talked about. I'm going to show it to you. So here's an example, Kansas. I've been talking about Kansas a lot. I apologize for that. It's just incredibly unusual what we saw in Kansas. First of all, the overall turnout, like most of the people, I think this is a self-selecting group. Anyone who would decide to get on a webinar about voter registration dashboard in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, you've almost certainly got an unusual interest in political data, which I appreciate as one of you. And so like me, I imagine when you saw what happened in Kansas, and the fact that the margin for the no vote, the pro-choice position was so large that it immediately brings up questions. To me, the immediate question was, well, what the electorate look like? It takes some number of weeks for states to produce vote history. We have that in Kansas, and we've shared reports on what the electorate looked like. But immediately that night, we could dig in and look at who was registering to vote in Kansas. And so to my point about voter registration being indicative of intensity enthusiasm, that night when we looked at voter registration in Kansas, and I've shared this all over, but I'll keep sharing it. When you looked at that point between Dobbs and the election, women were accounting for 70%, almost 70% of new registrants in the state. And that lags a little bit because I was looking on that night, so it didn't include all voter registrations, but it ended up being right at about a 40% gender gap. So that was our first indicator that women had a level of intensity and enthusiasm that was really unprecedented. In the end, when we got the vote history, that was carried out in the actual vote history. So that surge in registration was actually predictive of a surge in turnout, as you would expect. So this dashboard here, again, this is just an example. So you can look at the breakdown in Kansas. of the history. I mean, of the new registrants. And in this case, it's just looking at the complete year. So you can see broken down by age, 31% of the people who registered to vote in Kansas during the entirety of 2022, 31% were under the age of 25. Now, what you would see, and I'll walk you through some of this, is if you look at the difference after Dobbs, that number increased significantly. Women and younger voters especially surged in voter registration. So this data, I'm showing you Kansas. We have this data in the dashboard right now for 47 states and DC. We don't have North Dakota, New Hampshire, Wyoming. Apologies to those states, though we will be updating this constantly. And moving forward here, here's another example. In Pennsylvania, now what we're looking at here is the breakdown by age, and this is just looking at between when Dobbs leaked going forward in 2022. So Pennsylvania, it's pretty wild. 47% of people who registered after Dobbs leaked, which was around May 2nd, I think, of this year, 47% were under the age of 25. And again, I'll show you on the tool how you could actually compare that to the period before by toggling back and forth to see the actual difference and how new registrants changed and got younger. And in Pennsylvania's case, also more Democratic and more women after the Dobbs decision as compared to before. And here's Wisconsin. One more quick example. I'm going to switch over to the live site, and I'll just take a couple minutes on there. And then if y'all have questions, just throw them in the Q&A function. Wisconsin. So this is looking at since June 24th. So you'll see in the middle of the screen, and I have no idea if you can see my cursor, but you'll see this Dobbs timeline function. And right here, it says post Dobbs decision. So this is only looking at individuals who registered to vote in Wisconsin after June 24th of this year. And you can see how there's this big gender gap. Just about 48% of people who registered to vote during that time period since Dobbs were women, 39% men. Now, in Wisconsin is one of a handful of states that doesn't provide gender with registration. Some states make it optional, some states don't provide it at all, and some states will provide it for everyone. It varies. It's part of the work our team does. So we will fill in as many gaps as we can using modeling, using other consumer data sources, but especially with new registrants who perhaps haven't been through those processes yet, you'll see a larger percent in this case in the unknown category. Okay. So, I'm sorry. One more example here. This is North Carolina, again, showing since the leak, the gender gap and registration. So it says questions here, put them in the Q&A box. But what I'm going to do is stop sharing real quick and just switch over to the website and reshare so I can take you all through it. And I already see one great question, which is, when did I buy the Beastie Boys book? I don't remember. But I'm embarrassed to admit I've been I was 12 years old in 1986 when Licensed Tale came out. So I was right in their sweet spot. Okay. I'll take questions about books or voter registration data as well. You can just put them in the Q&A. All right, I'm going to take you to the website now. Hopefully y'all can see the website again. Team, let me know if you can't. But this is the live site. So if you go to insights.targetsmart.com, you'll see it as the first link on that page. In general, for those of you who aren't familiar with that page, I'm biased, but it has lots of great information, great analysis that our team puts together, and is always updating it with just new insights on what we're seeing in election data. And again, this is the most recent story on there. It'll link you to this site and to this dashboard. So you'll see here, there's a ton of things. I'm not going to go through every single thing because, again, I want to be respectful of y'all's time, especially during lunch hour for those of you on the East Coast. But I'm going to walk you through a few things. For here, you see this line graph, which I think is pretty obvious, but it's showing you the number of registrants by year that we've selected here. So 2018, 2020, 2022. the way that you can change this is I'm going to start with a state. Let's go back to Pennsylvania because I think that was an interesting one. No offense to other states. Every state is interesting in its own way, but Pennsylvania. So I'm just going to select Pennsylvania. Now, this is showing me new registration data by year. Now, remember, for these years, it's showing the complete year at this point, 2018, 2020, 2022, it's showing up to the most recent update. You can see down here on the left, it's telling us that the last update of the Pennsylvania file is as of September 2nd. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's getting new registrants exactly up to that date. That will lag a little bit, but it's generally going to be fairly close to that. Now, if you look here, it says Dobbs timeline. It's really where you can select which time periods you want to see. So here, if you look at all of 2022, it's showing that women were about +2, a little under actually, about +1.7 among new registrants and share. This is showing you the pie chart of new registrants. I can change that and say, let's just look after June 24th. Well, you see the big increase. Now it went from +1.7 women to plus almost 8 women. So you see where there's that surge in women registering to vote, occupying a larger share of the new registrants since Dobbs. I could throw in the leak period. So now this is between when the decision leaked in May to really up till now, because I'm keeping the post Dobbs in. You see it's a little bit more narrow. So there was an effect really after Dobbs. And you see on the line graph up here, this is when the Dobbs decision happened, and you see this spike immediately after seeing the effect of Dobbs. Now I can change this and I can look at party registration. Pennsylvania is a state that has party registration. So I'm going to go back now and I'm going to remove the period of the leak. So we're just going to see from June 24th forward. So since June 24th, among the 61,000 new registrants in Pennsylvania, Democrats have had a 25-point share advantage. You see that impact of Dobbs. Let me throw in pre-2022 here. And what you see is in 2020, Republicans actually had a 3-point advantage among new registrants. In 2018, Democrats had a much bigger advantage. Obviously, a much better year for Democrats nationally and in Pennsylvania. And then you look at, again, just this post-Dobbs period where the advantage is not only substantially bigger than 2020, where Republicans actually had advantage, but bigger than 2018 among these new registrants. Again, these are slightly different time periods because in 2022, we're only looking at post-Dobbs, whereas in these other years, we're looking at the entirety of the year. But you can play around with these different time periods and really select whatever element you want to look at. We looked at gender already, age. There was a slide on that, but I told you I'd show you how much it stands out. Here, voters under the age of 25 since Dobbs have accounted for 46% of new registrants in Pennsylvania. In 2020, where youth turnout was, quite good, that same age group was just about 39% of new registrants. You see in 2018, where we had that huge youth surge, just under 50% of new registrants. So you see where 2022 post Dobbs is falling really in between the two, a little bit closer to 2018 from that perspective. There's a bunch of different variables in here. Again, like I said, I'm not going to walk you through all of them, but you can limit this if you only wanted to look at urban new registrants or rural or suburban. You can look at multiple states at a time. Sometimes I'll go and I'll look at just the competitive Senate states. So you can click through or make up your own map and decide what you define as competitive. And then I can limit this. So I might say, well, I only want to look at the age breakdown of the women who have registered to vote. So that'll limit this now. Now you see the women are even younger. Women new registrants in Pennsylvania since Dobbs account for almost 50% of them are under the age of 25. Again, slightly below 2018, less so than overall. So not surprising because this is the trend we've seen everywhere. Women especially younger women, are registering at a much higher rate. All right, I'm going to take a breath here. I'm going to stop the share so I can see the full screen for the Q&A. I see we've got questions coming in now, so I'm going to jump to Q&A. And if anyone else has additional questions, throw them in. So, okay, first question. And these go back and forth. So on functionality of the website and overall, just sort of what we're seeing in the voter registration data, which I love. I welcome both of those. So we'll take both of them. I'll answer what I can, and any I can't, I'll defer to my team, and we can certainly follow up. We have a question: can you graph subgroups on the timeline? And I believe the answer to that is that line chart at the top will update based on what you are selecting, based on your selection. And my team's going to tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe that updates dynamically based on whatever you are selecting. And and to Kelly, you asked that question. If I'm wrong about that, my team will tell me, and we'll respond to you. Okay, a question about voter registration in Pennsylvania, noting that I tweeted yesterday about Dobbs' impact in Pennsylvania. The Philly Inquirer headline today says, Pennsylvania Republicans gaining on registered voters. What is the real story? Thank you for that question, because you've seen a lot of these stories out of Pennsylvania. There's a story in Axios today about voter registration in Iowa and suggesting that Republicans have had an advantage. A lot of this depends on the time frame. Republicans in a lot of these competitive states have had a registration advantage, in some cases since the 2020 election, in some cases like Pennsylvania, actually extending before the 2020 election. In Dobbs, since Dobbs, that's changed in almost every state, where the new voter registrations have become substantially more democratic. You saw the data that I just showed in Pennsylvania. A lot of the conversations around voter registration in Pennsylvania center around party switchers. Pennsylvania does a great job, the State Department of Elections, providing reports every month, or actually on a much more regular basis, on new registration and on registration counts overall. And they'll show people who have switched parties and from which parties they're switching, where they're going. And so, you know, party switching is really a lagging indicator. It's probably the last thing a voter does. We have, and I think you're all well aware of this, especially people from around Pennsylvania, especially in Western Pennsylvania, in the T as well. You have these areas where you have what we call the ancestral Democrats. People are registered Democrats, have been registered Democrats for quite some time, but stopped voting Democratic decades ago. And you know, eventually they'll get around to switching, especially if it's a state with a close primary and they want to vote in the opposite primary. So a lot of the data that you see that's more favorable to Republicans at this point centers on that. I don't think it necessarily impacts actual voting behavior in a current way as much as what we're seeing in new registrants. But no doubt, Republicans did build up a fairly substantial registration advantage in a lot of these key states prior to Dobbs. Thanks for the question, Kevin. Let's see. Can a user create their own key breaks in the timeline? No, you can't. You can actually, on the timeline, there's sliders, and you can actually, up top in the top left, you can choose how many weeks out from election day. So you can create your own timing break that way, where you can actually say, show me the data only from, 17 weeks out from election day. And it'll actually filter all the new voter registrations for this year and previous years based on that window. So you're looking at the same window within each year. So that is a pretty cool function. If we wanted to use one of your charts for an academic thesis, is there a process for asking for permission to reprint a generated table? I mean, look, in general, we encourage y'all to use this data, especially, for those in the academic community who are doing interesting research and furthering the objective of, defeating misinformation. We welcome that. If you ever have a question about your ability to use something, but again, generally we just ask that you give us attribution so folks know where it came from. But if you have a more specific question, you can always reach out. press@targetsmart.com is probably the easiest place to start for something like that. Again, press@targetsmart.com. But we encourage y'all to use this. So, and I see that's that email is in the chat. Mike asked the question of to what extent do we expect additional new registrations to increase up to election? So that's a cool thing. If you look at the chart on the website and you look at previous years, you can see it's basically as you would expect. The voter registration really builds to a peak the closer to the election you get. Most states do have voter registration deadlines for the election. And so you'll see that they peak. You know, I shared some data on Twitter over the weekend or a day or two ago showing voter registration trends in Kansas and a couple of other states. I think Pennsylvania was another I shared. And you see these big jumps on the chart where it looks like it goes up almost vertical in a day. And those were the voter registration deadlines before the primaries in those cases. So yes, we do expect voter registration. A big share of the voter registration that will happen in this cycle is happening right now and will continue to happen in a lot of these key states over the next couple of weeks. Let's see, best practices to use when pulling data from the dashboard to make sure what you share is accurate. Well, you know, the benefit is as long as you look at what filters you're pulling, that data will be accurate. You just have to pay attention to the filters that you're setting. Again, if you ever have a question, please just reach out. But that's the benefit of this and why we want to empower y'all to be able to, not that we don't want to hear from you, not that we aren't standing by to help if you have questions, but this also just empowers you to run your own counts. And then please share the things that you find interesting. But yeah, it will be accurate based on whatever filters you put in place. So just pay special attention to the filters that you have on there. And you'll know that it's valid. County by county data. Is county by county data available? Yes, we have it. No, I don't believe it's on the dashboard. I mean, part of this was just trying to think there's so many different things we could put on there. We welcome and encourage any feedback about things that are missing that you'd like to see in the future. I don't know that how much of it we can get to now. Obviously, our primary responsibility is working with our clients and making sure that they have everything they need down the home stretch here. But we do like to take this feedback in place. If it's something we can do easily, we'll address it. If not, it's something that we'll take into account in the future. Okay. Joe's question about Florida, why post-obs seems less so. So that's interesting. For those of you who dig in and playing around, we have seen the effect when you compare state to state to state, the effects certainly are different. I think, you know, in a lot of cases, we've seen that there's more of a post-Dobbs effect in states where they see a connection to their ability. I mean, Kansas, for example, where they're literally voting on a constitutional amendment. There's a direct connection and a, you know, frankly, a credibility to the notion that voting in that election, registering for that election could do something. I can't, obviously in Florida, a state where the Dobbs decision, I think, has been very present in the political conversation. I can't answer the question. In fact, folks who are organizing in Florida might have better notions of why we've seen less of an impact. But obviously in Florida recently, we've seen less favorable voter registration trends at all. The electorate there has moved more conservative in a lot of ways. I think that's a big challenge, frankly. And I do think that shows up in the post-Dobbs state. It doesn't mean that Florida is not competitive, but it's certainly not responding to Dobbs in aggregate the way Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan have, or other competitive states. Question about refresh dates. So generally, when the date that you see on there is going to be the date that the file was last updated in the system. Again, it depends on the state and when they provide updates. Some states are less frequent, some are more frequent. There are a ton of questions, which I really appreciate. And by the way, team, I know the team's monitoring these questions too. So if there are any other questions that I am missing that are important to get to, I'm going to get through as many of these as I can. But if you notice any that I haven't, please let me know. Any plans to add municipalities? Yeah, similarly, when you look at our Target Early site, which frankly has been around for a bit longer, and again, will be released in a week or two, we have more levels of geography. Part of it's just the constraints of the tool that we're working with, but helpful to get that sort of feedback. Is it possible to divide by age group within a specific gender? Yes. So those filters, you can apply as many filters as you want. And I certainly do that when I'm digging in. So I might limit it in the filters on the left to say, limit this only to 18 to 24-year-old, and then only show me women. And then you can look at partisan comparisons that are only looking at women age 18 to 24. You could add on top of that urbanicity to say, show me only suburban women between the age of 18 and 24. And then you select at the bottom what you want to display in the pie chart, partisanship. Obviously at that point, age and gender wouldn't apply because you've already filtered on that. Race or ethnicity you could look at. So yeah, you can filter by as many of those variables you want to. James asks a great question about differentiating new registrations from change registrations, address changes. So it's a great point. We do everything we can to differentiate between new registrations, first time seen versus someone who is just updating a voter registration. Some states will actually update the voter registration date when you change something on your voter registration. So again, we do everything we can to account for that, but that doesn't mean we're going to get it everywhere. Oriana's question about California, looking at California specifically, realized that after the Dobbs decision, voter registration numbers went down, which is surprising. Does that actually mean people are not registering? Does it mean that there's an issue with states reporting? Is it happening in other states? So that's one where I would look at, and I, to be honest, haven't looked at California recently. I would look at the update date. The other thing that I would note though is, sort of the flip side of the coin of what I mentioned earlier in talking about Florida. In states where choice is perceived as less at risk, we've seen less of an impact. So like Oregon is a state. The secondary component potentially impactful in California is California is a state that does a great job of registering people to vote automatically. And so in those states, Georgia is another one, Oregon's another one, where you see less of an impact into voter registration data because the unregistered population is so small. So even though there are a number, about half states, I think, have some form of automatic voter registration, they're not all equal. And so for the most part, these voter registration trends are telling. There's a handful of states where I think it would come with that caveat that you're maybe not seeing as much of an impact on the enthusiasm or intensity. Another great question from Joe. What can we do about states like Michigan, where in the last midterm we did not have automatic voter registration, but this year we do? Those are going to be the caveats that are incredibly important to note. And that's a great segue from the last question. That's in some cases where 2020 might be the better comparison. Like similarly, when we're looking at early vote data, vote by mail data, as the Target Early site will, the better comparison is going to be 2020, not in terms of raw numbers, because even though we anticipate turnout's going to be extremely high for a midterm election, it's not going to come close to 2020 presidential year turnout. But when you look at the actual shares of new registrants, or in that case, of early votes, and you look at what percent of them are coming from women versus men, younger versus older, Democrats versus Republicans, and so on and so forth, those shares comparing across years. So in a state like Michigan, where you've had a big change and you've added automatic voter registration, I would actually not pay as much attention to the raw numbers and pay more attention to the shares by different groups, and maybe pay a little bit more attention or a little bit more heed to 2020. Okay, a couple more questions, and then if anyone has any additional, I'm happy to take them. But y'all have had so many excellent questions, so I'll take a couple more, and then we will wrap up. And And again, then please follow up if you have additional questions or additional feedback. That press email that's in the chat is probably your best follow-up. Joanne asked the questions. I'm sort of wondering what I'm missing. I'm looking at all states year over year, and the 2022 isn't much higher than 2020. The female percent is 46% in both. Where were you seeing a spike in female registration? It's what I expected, but I don't see it. So, Joanna, I would actually say the national comparisons are probably the least relevant, because if you remember in 2022, and as you look through the updates, every state is updated at far different cadence. So there are some states, and not to point the finger, but some of the southern states like a Mississippi or an Alabama might update much less frequently. So when you look at that, the last update there might be from a month or two ago. And so you don't have any Dobbs effect, or you only have a minimal amount built in. And also you don't have the number of new registrants. Whereas in 2020 or 2018, you have the full cycle. The other important point to remember is, again, 2020 is a presidential cycle. So in terms of raw registrants, there are almost certainly going to be fewer this cycle in most places. And then finally, 2018 and 2020 were these unusually high turnout elections and also unusually high registration elections. So that means the percent of eligible unregistered voters, just as we talked about California with the automatic voter registration, nationally, you just have a smaller pool of unregistered voters to go after. So I wouldn't look at that and say, well, there are fewer registrants, new registrants this year, therefore there's lower intensity this year. It's more interesting to look at the share differences. John, great question. Any way that you have been able to tie back increases in registration to actual reg programs on the ground in the state? So unfortunately, no, but we certainly do encourage that type of feedback. We don't have that level of visibility into specifically, even though we are working with these organizations, they're using our data. They take the data, they do what they will with it, which is incredible work, but the data is not flowing back to us. Their data is their data. So we don't have visibility into how much of this is efforted, because it's a question we get a lot. How much of this is through actual voter registration programs versus how much of this is organic enthusiasm? We can't answer that question, but there are a lot of great organizations that are doing voter registration on the ground that can. And if anyone's interested in a follow-up, we'd be happy to make connections. Last question. Interested in the post-Dobbs decision's impact on Democratic female registrations in Georgia to see if Stacey has an advantage over Kemp. Not seeing any information populating. So yeah, you can do that in Georgia. You select Georgia, and then you can select the post-Dobbs period, compare it to before. I will note in Georgia is one of the states that, as I mentioned before, has automatic voter registration, has a much smaller unregistered eligible population there than most states. Georgia also has one of the youngest, as the second youngest electorate in the country, behind only California. And it has the most heavily female electorate. Average is 55% women. The indicator that we're tracking among many, but beyond voter registration at this point in Georgia, is the absentee ballot requests. In Georgia, that has been going on for a couple of weeks now, and we are seeing women outpacing their share of absentee ballot requests from 2020 at the same point in time. In 2020, they accounted for 58% of mail ballot requests. Right now, women in Georgia are accounting for 60% of mail ballot requests. And when you look at the racial numbers, African-American voters, especially at this point in 2020, they accounted for 30% of mail ballot requests. Right now, African-American voters account for 37% in Georgia. So that certainly is a sign that the intensity is there. It's an early sign, but all of these come with this caveat that this is, still a relatively early indicator of intensity. We know the Republican intensity enthusiasm was there pre-Dobbs to a certain extent. We've seen this increase among Democrats, especially in these key states. Trying to measure them against each other to get a sense of which side has the advantage, I think, is impossible. I think what it's clear is a lot of races, a lot of states that maybe wouldn't have been competitive or where Republicans would be favored. This data is suggesting that these races are going to be incredibly close. I know that feels like a cop out probably to say it's going to be close, but that's where we are. Thank you all so much for coming. I see one more question coming in. I'm going to take this question, then we're going to wrap up. Even though I know we have 15 minutes, I feel like I've taken up so much time already. Re-upping my question, like what Tom just said, did the data exist to make something like this to track early voting, absentee ballots, requests, et cetera? Yes. So it's our Target Early site, targetearly.targetsmart.com. Right now, that's just showing the dashboards from previous cycles that will be live in the next week or two. We have the site ready to go. We're just waiting until we get to, a critical mass. At this point, we're getting data in from North Carolina on actual votes. South Dakota is dumping a bunch. I don't imagine, not to denigrate South Dakota, but I don't imagine there's a ton of interest in parsing that data. Though frankly, I would look at anything at this point when it comes to votes. But in the next week or two, Michigan starts tomorrow. There are a number of states that are starting this week. So in the next week or two, we'll have enough early vote data, either early in person or mail balloting. That'll be up on that site. We will be sure to push that out. If you're not on our mailing list, you can sign up for it because we push announcements out there. So please take a look at that too. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your day, middle of the day, middle of the week. Really appreciate it. Please keep the feedback coming. And any follow-up questions, reach out to that press at targetsmart.com. And that's it. Y'all have a great day. Take care.